I stood in the doorway of what used to be my own master bedroom, watching my daughter Rebecca arrange fresh flowers on the nightstand like she was the lady of the house. The irony wasn't lost on me that these were peonies from my own garden, the ones I'd planted and tended for 15 years. She didn't even look up when I cleared my throat. "Mom, could you close the door on your way out? David and I need some privacy to discuss our renovation plans." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Our renovation plans for my house. The house I'd worked 3 jobs to buy after her father left us when she was 12. The same house where I'd held her through nightmares, helped her with homework at the kitchen table, and celebrated every milestone from first steps to college graduation. Now I was being dismissed from my own bedroom like hired help. The basement where I'd been sleeping for the past 2 months was damp, cold, and smelled like old concrete. The single mattress on the floor was barely wider than a prison cot, and the thin blanket did nothing against the February chill that seeped through the foundation walls. But what cut deeper than the physical discomfort was the casual cruelty in Rebecca's voice, the way she spoke to me like I was an inconvenience. She was graciously tolerating. I pulled the door shut and walked down the narrow hallway past family photos that suddenly felt like evidence of a life I no longer recognized. In every picture, Rebecca's smile was bright and genuine, her arm around my shoulders, her eyes full of the love and respect I thought would last forever. Now, those same eyes looked through me like I was invisible. The woman staring back at me from the hallway mirror looked older than her 62 years. Helen Morrison, grandmother of 2, retired elementary school teacher, and apparently unwelcome guest in her own home. My gray hair hung limply around my shoulders, and my clothes looked rumpled from sleeping on that awful mattress. When had I become this person? When had I stopped fighting for myself? It started innocently enough, the way most betrayals do. Rebecca had called me 6 months earlier, her voice thick with tears and desperation. She and David were going through a rough patch financially. His construction business had taken several hits during the economic downturn, and they were behind on their mortgage payments. With little Emma just starting kindergarten and baby Joshua barely walking, they were drowning in bills and facing foreclosure. "Mom, I don't know what else to do," she'd sobbed into the phone. "We might lose everything. The kids would have to change schools, and Emma's finally settled in. I know it's a lot to ask, but could we maybe stay with you for just a few weeks? Just until David gets back on his feet?" My heart had broken listening to her. This was my baby girl, the child I'd raised alone after her father decided that family life wasn't adventurous enough for him. I'd worked myself to exhaustion to make sure she never went without, taking on extra tutoring sessions and weekend catering jobs to pay for dance lessons, summer camps, and eventually her college education. She was my greatest accomplishment, my pride and joy, the living proof that I'd done something right in this world. "Of course, sweetheart," I'd said without hesitation. "You know this house is always open to you and the children. We'll figure everything out together." That first week had felt like a blessing. The house came alive with the sound of children's laughter echoing through rooms that had been too quiet since Rebecca moved out 8 years earlier. Little Emma helped me bake cookies in the kitchen where her mother had once stood on a stool, doing the same thing. Joshua took his first independent steps across my living room carpet, his chubby hands reaching for the same wooden blocks Rebecca had played with as a toddler. Even David seemed grateful and respectful. He helped with yard work, fixed a leaky faucet I'd been meaning to address for months, and insisted on cooking dinner several nights to show his appreciation. He called me Mom Helen and made a point of asking about my day, my book club, my volunteer work at the local literacy center. For the first time in years, I felt like I was part of a real family again. Rebecca was the daughter I'd always dreamed of having as an adult. She sought my advice on everything from Emma's school troubles to her own career decisions. We spent long evenings talking after the children were asleep, sharing stories and laughing about old memories. She asked to see photo albums from her childhood, marveling at pictures she'd forgotten existed. When she hugged me goodnight, she held on longer than necessary and whispered, "Thank you for saving us, Mom. I don't know what we would have done without you." Those words wrapped around my heart like a warm blanket. This was what I'd worked for, sacrificed for, dreamed of during all those lonely years. My daughter needed me, trusted me, valued me. I wasn't just an aging woman living alone with too many empty rooms and too much silence. I was essential. I was loved. I was home. The children quickly established routines that revolved around me. Emma would crawl into my bed on Saturday mornings to watch cartoons and eat the special cinnamon toast I made just for her. Joshua would clap his hands whenever he saw me come through the front door, reaching up to be held. They called me Grandma, Helen, in voices so sweet they could melt the hardest heart, and I spoiled them shamelessly with extra bedtime stories, impromptu ice cream runs, and the kind of unconditional love that only grandparents can provide. David's gratitude seemed genuine too. He would often pull me aside to express how much my generosity meant to him. "You're an angel, Mom Helen," he'd say, his voice earnest and sincere. "Most mothers-in-law wouldn't be half this understanding. Rebecca's lucky to have you, and so, are we?" He'd even started calling me Mom instead of Mrs. Morrison, something that touched me more than I cared to admit. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rebecca began including me in decisions that felt important and significant. She asked my opinion on Emma's teacher conference, wanted my input on Joshua's sleeping schedule, and even consulted me about her own job interview outfits. We grocery, shopped together, cooked together, and spent lazy Sunday afternoons working in the garden while the children played nearby. I felt useful again, needed again, central to someone's world again. The house itself seemed happier too. Toys scattered across the living room floor brought color and life to spaces that had grown too neat and orderly. Children's artwork decorated the refrigerator, and the sound of cartoons mixed with giggles filled weekend mornings that had previously been marked only by the ticking of clocks and the whisper of pages turning. Even my neighbors commented on how wonderful it was to see the house full of family again. A few weeks stretched into a month, then 2 months, but I didn't mind. How could I? This was everything I'd been missing without even realizing it. The purpose, the chaos, the feeling of being absolutely essential to people I loved more than my own life. David's business was slowly recovering, he assured me. They were just waiting for a few big contracts to come through, and then they'd be back on their feet and out of my hair. But I didn't want them out of my hair. For the first time since Rebecca had moved out after college, I wasn't rattling around in a house built for a family, making dinner for one and talking to myself just to hear a human voice. I was Gran and Mom Helen and the person everyone turned to when they needed comfort, advice, or just someone to listen. I was exactly who I'd always wanted to be. Rebecca started asking me to babysit more frequently so she and David could have date nights to work on their marriage. I was thrilled to help. Spending evenings with Emma and Joshua while their parents reconnected felt like the most natural thing in the world. We'd make popcorn and watch Disney movies, build elaborate blanket forts in the living room, and I'd tell them stories about their mother's childhood that made them giggle and beg for more. During these quiet evenings, I'd look around at the toys scattered on my coffee table, the small shoes lined up by the front door, the sippy cups drying in my dish rack, and feel a contentment I hadn't experienced in years. This was what homes were meant to be, full of love and laughter and the beautiful chaos that comes with raising children. I'd spent too many years in sterile silence, and now I was remembering what it felt like to be truly alive. The financial arrangement we'd settled into felt fair and reasonable. Since they were staying in my house rent-free, Rebecca and David covered groceries and utilities, which actually lowered my monthly expenses considerably. I was able to put more money into my savings account for the first time in years, and the bulk buying that came with feeding a family of 5 meant we were all eating better and more economically. It seemed like the perfect solution for everyone involved. Rebecca had even started talking about the future in ways that included me. She mentioned how nice it would be if I could help with the children more regularly, how much Emma loved having Grandma Helen around for homework, help, and bedtime stories. "I never realized how much I missed having family close by," she'd say, her arm linked through mine as we watched the children play in the backyard. "The kids are so much happier with you in their daily lives." Those words meant everything to me. I'd worried for years that I was becoming one of those burdensome older parents, calling too often and wanting too much attention from my adult daughter. But here was proof that I was still valuable, still necessary, still bringing joy and stability to the people who mattered most. The loneliness that had been my constant companion for so many years seemed like a distant memory. David had even started making comments about how much sense it made for us all to live together permanently. "Why should you be in this big house all alone, Mom Helen, when we could be here helping each other out? It's like having a built-in support system." The idea thrilled me more than I wanted to admit. Maybe this was how families were supposed to work in the modern world, multiple generations under one roof, sharing resources and responsibilities and love. The children were thriving too. Emma's grades had improved since having Grandma Helen available for homework help every evening, and Joshua was developing vocabulary at a rapid pace, partly because he had 3 adults instead of 2 giving him constant attention and encouragement. They seemed more secure, more confident, surrounded by so much love and stability. How could anyone argue with results like that? Even my own health seemed to be improving. The daily activity that came with chasing toddlers and helping with school projects kept me moving in ways my previous sedentary lifestyle hadn't. I was sleeping better, eating more regularly, and laughing more than I had in years. My doctor commented during my annual checkup that whatever I was doing was working. My blood pressure was down, and I seemed more energetic and positive than she'd seen me in a long time. The only tiny concern I had was financial. Even though my expenses were lower in some ways, they were definitely higher in others. The grocery bills for 5 people instead of 1 were substantial, and children required a constant stream of supplies. School clothes, shoes that were outgrown every few months, birthday party gifts for classmates, field trip fees, and countless other expenses that I found myself covering more and more often. Rebecca and David were careful to contribute what they could, but David's income was still unpredictable, and every emergency seemed to fall on my shoulders. But these were small prices to pay for the joy of being truly needed again. When Emma threw her arms around my neck and whispered, "I love you, Grandma Helen," or when Joshua fell asleep in my lap during story time, any financial concerns seemed petty and unimportant. This was what mattered: family, love, connection, purpose. Everything else was just details that could be worked out. Rebecca seemed to sense my contentment and began making comments about how perfect our arrangement was. "I don't know why everyone doesn't live this way," she'd say as we cleaned up after dinner together. "It's so much easier when there are more hands to help, and the kids get so much more attention and love. You're like the grandmother every child dreams of having." Her words wrapped around my heart like the warmest embrace. As we approached the 3-month mark, I found myself hoping they'd never leave. The house had become a home again in the truest sense, filled with purpose and laughter, and the kinds of memories I'd treasure forever. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we'd face them together as a family. At least that's what I believed then. In those golden weeks when everything seemed perfect, and I felt more valuable and loved than I had in decades. I had no idea that the very happiness and security I was treasuring would soon become the foundation for the most devastating betrayal I could ever imagine. The people I loved most, the family I'd sacrificed everything to support and nurture, were already planning something that would shatter my world and leave me questioning everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and the true meaning of family. But in those beautiful, innocent days, I was just a grandmother who thought she'd finally found her place in the world again. The first crack in my perfect family fantasy appeared on a Tuesday morning in late October. I was making pancakes for the children, humming softly as I flipped each golden circle in the pan. Emma was at the kitchen table working on her spelling homework, and Joshua was in his high chair, babbling happily while smearing banana across his face. It was one of those peaceful domestic moments that made my heart swell with contentment. Rebecca walked into the kitchen wearing her work clothes, checking her phone with a frown. She grabbed a piece of toast from the counter and took a quick bite before speaking. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something. David and I were discussing our situation last night, and we think it might be time to make some changes around here." I turned from the stove, spatula still in hand, a smile on my face. "What kind of changes, sweetheart? Are you thinking about redecorating? I'd love to help with that." She exchanged a glance with David, who had just entered the kitchen wearing his work boots and carrying his coffee mug. Something in their shared look made my stomach flutter with unease, though I couldn't pinpoint why. "It's more about the living arrangements," Rebecca continued, her tone carefully neutral. "We've been here almost 4 months now, and we're starting to feel like we're imposing on your space. You've been so generous, but we need to start thinking about long-term solutions." My heart began to race. Were they planning to leave? The thought of returning to an empty house, of losing the daily chaos and laughter that had become my lifeline, made me feel slightly sick. "Oh, but you're not imposing at all," I said quickly. "I love having you here. The house feels like a real home again." David cleared his throat and set his mug down on the counter. "That's actually what we wanted to discuss, Mom Helen. We've been thinking that maybe instead of us moving out and you rattling around in this big house alone, we could make this arrangement more permanent, more official." Relief flooded through me so powerfully that I had to grip the counter for support. "You mean you'd want to stay? Really?" "Well, it would need some adjustments," Rebecca said, her voice taking on a businesslike tone I'd never heard her use with me before. "We'd want to contribute more significantly to the household, maybe take over more of the responsibilities. David's business is picking up now, and we could handle the mortgage payments, property taxes, utilities, all of that." "That's incredibly generous of you both," I said, though something in their manner was making me feel oddly uncomfortable. "But this is my home. I can handle my own expenses." Rebecca and David exchanged another look, this one longer and more meaningful. David stepped forward with what I would later recognize as his salesman smile, the one he used when trying to convince clients to upgrade their construction packages. "The thing is, Mom Helen, we've been doing some research, and we think there might be a better way to structure things. More efficient, you know? With David's income improving and our need for stability with the kids, we could take over as the primary residence. You'd still live here, of course, but we'd handle all the big decisions, the maintenance, the financial responsibilities." The pancakes were burning. I turned off the heat and moved the pan, my hands beginning to shake slightly. "I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting." Rebecca's voice softened, taking on the patient tone she used when explaining difficult concepts to her children. "Mom, you're getting older. You shouldn't have to worry about things like roof repairs and property taxes and all the stress that comes with homeownership. What if we took over those burdens for you? You could just relax and enjoy your retirement without all the responsibility." The words hit me like cold water. Getting older, burdens, responsibility. These weren't words of love and gratitude. They were words of dismissal, of someone being gently pushed aside. "But I'm only 62, I said weakly. "I'm perfectly capable of managing my own home." "Of course you are," David said quickly, his tone soothing but somehow condescending. "But why should you have to? We're family. Let us take care of you for a change." Emma looked up from her homework, sensing the tension in the room even if She couldn't understand it. "Grandma Helen, are you okay? You look sad." I forced a smile and ruffled her hair. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just thinking about grown-up stuff." But I wasn't fine. Something fundamental had shifted in that kitchen conversation, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being maneuvered into something I didn't fully understand. The way Rebecca and David had clearly discussed this privately, the careful way they were presenting their solution, the assumption that I needed to be taken care of rather than appreciated for my contributions, it all felt wrong. Over the following days, I noticed things I'd previously overlooked or explained away. Rebecca had started rearranging furniture without asking, moving pieces that had been in the same spots for years. When I questioned her about it, she smiled and said she was just optimizing the space for the family. David had begun making home improvement plans, measuring windows and making notes about necessary upgrades without consulting me about any of it. They talked about the house differently now, using phrases like, "when we redo the kitchen," and "after we expand the master bathroom." Not if, but when, as though these decisions had already been made. When I tried to join these conversations, offering my own opinions about my own home, they would nod politely and then continue discussing their plans as though I hadn't spoken. The children's routines began changing in subtle ways. Instead of coming to me for help with homework, Emma was redirected to ask her mother or father. Joshua's bedtime stories, which had become our special time together, were suddenly being handled by Rebecca, who explained that she wanted to be more involved in his nighttime routine. My input on discipline, feeding schedules, and daily activities was quietly but firmly discouraged. "We really appreciate everything you've done," Rebecca said when I tried to maintain my role in the children's lives. "But David and I need to establish ourselves as the primary authority figures. It's better for the kids to have clear boundaries about who makes the decisions." I felt like I was being demoted in my own home, shifted from beloved grandmother and household matriarch to helpful but ultimately peripheral presence. The children still loved me, but they were being subtly trained to look to their parents first, to see me as secondary to the real decision-makers in the house. My bedroom situation became another source of quiet tension. What had started as my temporary move to the guest room to give Rebecca and David privacy in the master suite was now being discussed as a permanent arrangement. "You seem so comfortable in the smaller room," Rebecca observed. And honestly, with David's early work schedule and the baby still waking up sometimes, it's probably better if you're not right next door. The master suite just makes more sense for a family with young children. The guest room was pleasant enough, but it was half the size of my former bedroom and lacked the walk-in closet and ensuite bathroom I'd enjoyed for 15 years. More importantly, it felt like exile from my own space, a clear signal that I was no longer the primary resident of my own home. Financial discussions began taking on a different tone as well, instead of the grateful appreciation I'd grown accustomed to. There were subtle suggestions that I was somehow benefiting from their presence more than they were benefiting from mine. "Your utility bills must be so much lower now that we're splitting everything," Rebecca would say. "And having David here to handle maintenance and repairs is probably saving you thousands of dollars a year." When I mentioned that my grocery expenses had tripled and that I'd been covering more and more of the children's costs, Rebecca looked surprised and slightly hurt. "Mom, we never asked you to do that. If money is tight for you, we can adjust our arrangement. Maybe you could contribute a set amount each month for food and household expenses instead of just buying whatever you think we need." The suggestion that I should pay them to live in my own house left me speechless. Somehow, without my realizing it, the dynamic had completely flipped. Instead of being the generous mother helping her struggling daughter, I was being positioned as the dependent, older relative who needed to pay her fair share. David's attitude toward me began shifting in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. The warm, "Mom, Helen" greetings were replaced with polite nods. He stopped asking about my day or my activities, treating me more like a roommate than a beloved family member. When I tried to contribute to conversations about household decisions, he would listen with obvious patience and then proceed with whatever he and Rebecca had already decided. The breaking point came during a discussion about Thanksgiving. Plans. I'd been excitedly planning the menu and preparing to host the holiday as I had every year since Rebecca was a child. I'd already bought the turkey and started making lists of side dishes, looking forward to cooking for my family in my own kitchen. Rebecca approached me while I was reviewing recipes at the kitchen table. "Mom, David and I have been talking, and we think it might be better if we handle Thanksgiving this year. With everything that's been changing around here, it seems like a good time for us to start taking on more of the hosting responsibilities." I looked up from my grandmother's stuffing recipe, the one Rebecca had begged me to teach her just 2 years earlier. "But I always host Thanksgiving. It's one of my favorite traditions." "I know, and you do such a beautiful job," Rebecca said, her tone gentle but firm. "But you've been doing it for so many years. Don't you think you deserve a break? Let us take care of everything this time. You can just relax and enjoy the meal." The message was clear. I was being retired from my role as family hostess, gently but decisively pushed aside in favor of the younger generation. My traditions, my recipes, my plans, none of it mattered anymore. I was being given permission to attend a holiday meal in my own home, as a guest rather than the host. That night, I lay in the guest room listening to Rebecca and David talking in low voices in what used to be my bedroom. I couldn't make out the words, but their tones were businesslike, planning, decisive. They were making decisions about our shared future, about my home, about my life, and I wasn't part of the conversation. I began to notice other small changes that individually meant nothing but collectively painted a disturbing picture. Mail addressed to me was being opened by David, who explained that he was helping to organize household paperwork. Important phone calls were being screened through Rebecca, who would decide whether something was urgent enough to interrupt my rest time. My opinions on everything from dinner menus to weekend plans were politely acknowledged and then ignored. The most painful realization was that my usefulness was being systematically eliminated. Every role I'd played in the household, every contribution I'd made, was being quietly transferred to Rebecca and David. I was being made redundant in my own life, surplus to requirements in my own home. When I tried to discuss my concerns with Rebecca, she responded with the kind of patient exasperation usually reserved for difficult elderly relatives. "Mom, I think you're overthinking this. We're family. We're all just trying to find the best way to live together happily. Nobody's trying to push you out or take over your life. We love you, and we want what's best for everyone." But what was best for everyone, apparently, didn't include my input, my preferences, or my authority in my own home. I was being loved, right out of my own life, smothered with kindness while being systematically stripped of agency and respect. The children began reflecting these changed dynamics in their behavior toward me. Where once they had run to me with scraped knees and hurt feelings, they now looked to their parents first. Where once they had sought my opinion on important matters, like which book to read or what game to play, they now deferred to Rebecca and David's judgment. I was still beloved Grandma Helen, but I was no longer an authority figure, no longer someone whose word carried weight in the household. The most heartbreaking moment came when Emma asked me if she could have a sleepover with her friend Sarah. Before I could answer, she quickly added, "But I have to check with Mom and Dad first because they make the real decisions." The casual acceptance in her voice, the matter-of-fact way she acknowledged that I wasn't really in charge of anything anymore, cut deeper than any direct confrontation could have. I realized that I was watching my own life being dismantled piece by piece, relationship by relationship, tradition by tradition. The daughter I'd raised to be strong and independent was using those very qualities to systematically undermine my position in my own home. The son-in-law who'd called me an angel was now treating me like a slightly bothersome but tolerated houseguest. And the most devastating part was how reasonable it all sounded when they explained it. They were helping me. They were taking burdens off my shoulders. They were ensuring that I could enjoy my golden years without stress or responsibility. Who could argue with such thoughtful, loving children? But late at night in that guest room that was becoming my permanent exile, I knew the truth. I wasn't being helped. I was being replaced. I wasn't being relieved of burdens. I was being relieved of my own life. And the family I'd sacrificed everything to support was orchestrating my disappearance with smiles on their faces and love in their voices. The worst part was that I could see exactly where this was heading, but I felt powerless to stop it. Every attempt I made to reassert my authority was met with gentle resistance and patient explanations about why their way was better. Every effort I made to maintain my traditions and relationships was quietly redirected or postponed until I eventually stopped trying. I was being erased from my own existence by the people who claimed to love me most, and they were doing it so skillfully, so gradually, so lovingly, that I almost believed I should be grateful for the privilege. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it a bone-deep cold that seemed to settle permanently in my chest. The guest room had always been chilly, but now that it was apparently my permanent residence, the inadequate heating became impossible to ignore. I'd mentioned it to David twice, asking if he could look at the vents or maybe add a space heater, but both times he'd nodded absently and then nothing had happened. "It's probably better to keep that room cooler anyway," Rebecca had said when I brought it up to her. "Hot bedrooms aren't good for sleep quality. You'll rest better in the cooler temperature." Her dismissal was so casual, so matter-of-fact, that I almost believed her concern was genuine. Almost. The real shift began on a gray December morning when I walked into the kitchen to find Rebecca and David huddled over paperwork at my dining table. They looked up when I entered, and something in their expressions reminded me of children caught with their hands in the cookie jar. Rebecca quickly gathered the papers into a neat stack and slid them into a folder. "Good morning, Mom," she said brightly, her smile a little too wide. "We were just reviewing some household budgeting. David's been helping me organize our finances. Our finances." I poured myself coffee with hands that trembled slightly. When had my personal financial situation become our anything? "What kind of budgeting?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light and curious rather than suspicious. David stood up and stretched, his movement casual but somehow blocking my view of the folder Rebecca was still clutching. "Just looking at ways to make the household run more efficiently. You know, utilities, maintenance costs, property taxes, boring adult stuff. Property taxes. On my house. That I paid." The coffee suddenly tasted bitter in my mouth. If there are financial concerns, I should probably be involved in those discussions. Rebecca's laugh was musical, but somehow sharp around the edges. "Mom, you don't need to worry about any of that anymore. Remember? We talked about taking those burdens off your shoulders. David's really good with numbers and budgets. He handles all the financial planning for his business." The word "anymore" hung in the air like a threat. As if my involvement in my own financial affairs was a thing of the past, a responsibility I'd already relinquished without realizing it. I sat down at my own table, uninvited to my own financial planning meeting, and watched my daughter and son-in-law exchange meaningful glances over my head. "I think I should at least know what's being discussed," I said, my voice smaller than I intended. "This is still my house." David's expression became patient in the way people are patient with stubborn children. "Of course it is, Mom Helen. But you've been so generous in letting us take on more responsibilities. We're just trying to make sure everything runs smoothly for everyone." That afternoon, while Rebecca was at work and David was allegedly meeting with clients, I decided to check my mail. It was something I'd done every day for 15 years, a simple routine that connected me to the outside world. But when I opened the mailbox, it was empty. Not just empty of letters for me, but completely. Empty. I stood there staring into the metal box, confusion washing over me like cold water. It was Wednesday. There was always mail on Wednesday. Bills, advertisements, the weekly grocery store circulars, something. The postal service didn't just skip houses randomly. When David returned that evening, I asked him about it. "Oh, I had the mail forwarded to a P.O. box," he said casually, hanging his jacket in the closet that used to hold only my coats. "It's more secure that way, and it keeps important documents from getting lost or stolen. I'll bring it in and sort it every few days." "But I like getting my own mail," I protested, feeling foolish even as I said it. "It's part of my daily routine." Rebecca looked up from helping Emma with homework at the kitchen table. "Mom, David's." "Just trying to help. You know how identity theft is such a problem these days. Having mail sitting in an unlocked mailbox is really risky. This way, all our important documents are safe. All our important documents. As if my social security statements and retirement account notifications and personal correspondence were somehow community property to be managed by my son-in-law. I wanted to argue, but with Emma sitting right there, absorbed in her math problems, it felt petty and inappropriate. So I said nothing, and my daily connection to the outside world was severed without further discussion. The isolation began to feel more deliberate after that. Phone calls that used to come directly to me were increasingly routed through Rebecca. "Mom, Mrs. Patterson called about the book club meeting," she'd say. "I told her you probably wouldn't be able to make it this month. You've seemed so tired lately." But I wasn't tired. I was frustrated and confused and increasingly angry, but I wasn't tired. I loved book club. It was one of the few social connections I had outside the house, a place where I was still Helen Morrison, the retired teacher, not just somebody's burden or house guest. When I protested that I wanted to go, Rebecca's concern seemed genuine but immovable. "I really think you should rest more," she said, her hand cool on my forehead as if checking for fever. "You've been doing so much for all of us. Maybe it's time to let some of those outside commitments go and just focus on family." Let those commitments go. As if my friendships and interests were optional extras rather than essential parts of who I was. As if being relegated to family duties was somehow a promotion rather than a demotion. I felt like I was being systematically disconnected from everything that made me myself, pruned down to only the parts that served their vision of our household. The children's attitudes toward me continued to evolve in ways that broke my heart. Emma still loved me, but there was a new formality in how she interacted with me, as if she'd been coached on appropriate boundaries. When I offered to help with her school project about family trees, she hesitated and said, "I should probably ask Mom first if that's okay." Joshua, barely 2 years old, was being actively redirected away from me during the times when he would naturally seek comfort or attention. If he fell and ran to me crying, Rebecca would swoop in and say, "Come to Mama, sweetie. Grandma's hands aren't as steady as they used to be." My hands were perfectly steady, but the implication was planted like a seed in his developing mind. Grandma isn't quite capable anymore. The physical changes to my living space became more dramatic and less subtle. My bedroom furniture, the pieces I'd carefully chosen and arranged over years of living in this house, were being moved without consultation. "We're just optimizing the flow," David explained when I found my grandmother's antique dresser shoved into a corner where it clearly didn't fit. "The room works better with the bed positioned differently." But it wasn't positioned better for me. The new arrangement blocked my view of the garden I'd tended for 15 years, the one bright spot I could see from my bed each morning. The mirror was angled wrong for my height, and the bedside table was too far away for me to reach comfortably. It was as if the room was being arranged for someone else entirely, someone whose needs and preferences didn't matter. My belongings began disappearing in small increments. Not stolen, exactly, but relocated to places where I couldn't easily access them. My favorite reading chair was moved to the basement, for storage. My collection of vintage cookbooks was boxed up and put in the attic to make room for David's business files. My grandmother's china cabinet was emptied and converted to display David's fishing trophies, because the children might break the dishes. Each change was explained with logic that sounded reasonable on the surface, but felt devastating in practice. I was watching my life being dismantled piece by piece, my history and personality being edited out of my own home to make room for their vision of how things should be. The basement became David's unofficial office, which meant my access to storage areas and my own Christmas decorations was suddenly restricted. "I've got important paperwork down there," he said when I asked to retrieve my holiday ornaments. "Maybe we should just buy new decorations this year. Simpler, more modern stuff that's easier to put up and take down." But I didn't want simple, modern decorations. I wanted the ornaments Emma had made in preschool, the ones Rebecca had crafted in Girl Scouts, the delicate glass balls that had belonged to my mother. I wanted the family history that came with boxes of carefully preserved memories, not generic store-bought replacements that had no meaning or connection to our shared past. "You're being sentimental," Rebecca said when I tried to explain why. "The old decorations mattered. Sometimes it's better to let go of things that are just cluttering up our lives. The kids will make new memories with new ornaments." Our lives. As if my memories and my sentimental attachments were somehow communal property that could be voted on and discarded by committee. I felt like I was disappearing, being slowly erased from my own existence while being told it was for my own good. The financial control became more obvious and more troubling. Bills that had always come to me directly were now being handled entirely by David. When I asked to see my property tax statement, he waved me away with an indulgent smile. "Already taken care of, Mom Helen. You don't need to worry about any of that stuff anymore." But I wanted to worry about it. It was my house, my responsibility, my right to know what was happening with my own financial obligations. When I insisted on seeing the statements, David's patience began to fray around the edges. "Look, I'm trying to help you here," he said, his voice taking on an edge I'd never heard before. "You asked us to take on more responsibility around here, and that's what we're doing. But if you're going to micromanage every little thing, maybe we need to reconsider this whole arrangement." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Comply with their management of my affairs, or risk losing them entirely. The children I loved, the family connection I craved, the purpose I'd found in helping them. All of it could disappear if I insisted on maintaining control over my own life. It was emotional extortion, wrapped in concern, and presented as logic. Rebecca's approach was different but equally effective. She would sit beside me and take my hand in hers, her voice soft and loving. "Mom, I know this is hard. Change is always difficult, especially as we get older. But David and I only want what's best for you. We want you to be able to relax and enjoy your retirement without all the stress of managing everything by yourself." As we get older. There it was again, the gentle but persistent implication that I was declining, becoming incapable, sliding into a phase of life where independence was no longer appropriate or safe. I was 62, not 92. I was healthy, sharp, and fully capable of managing my own affairs. But their narrative was becoming the accepted reality, and my protests were being framed as confusion or stubbornness, rather than legitimate concerns. The social isolation became more complete when my church activities were quietly curtailed. I'd been an active member of St. Mark's Episcopal for over 20 years, serving on committees, helping with community outreach, participating in the Women's Auxiliary. It was a huge part of my identity and my social network. But suddenly, getting to Sunday services became complicated. David needed the car for work emergencies. Rebecca had appointments that conflicted with my usual service time. The children had activities that required my babysitting during church hours. Every week brought a new reason why attending church was inconvenient or impossible. We could find you a nice service to watch on television, Rebecca suggested helpfully. It's probably easier than getting dressed and driving all the way across town anyway. And this way you won't have to worry about the weather or feeling obligated to stay for coffee hour when you're tired. But I wasn't tired, and I wasn't worried about the weather. I was desperate for connection with people who knew me as Helen Morrison, the person. Not Helen Morrison, the inconvenient elderly relative. I needed conversations that weren't filtered through Rebecca and David's assessment of what was appropriate for me to handle. When I finally managed to arrange my own transportation to church through my friend Margaret, Rebecca's reaction was swift and concerned. "Mom, I really don't think it's safe for you to be riding with other people. What if there's an accident? What if Margaret has a medical emergency while she's driving? You could both be seriously hurt." The concern sounded genuine, but the subtext was clear. You cannot be trusted to make decisions about your own safety and well-being. You need our supervision and approval for any activity outside this house. You are no longer competent to assess risk or manage your own social life. By February, I realized that I was living under a form of house arrest disguised as loving care. My mail was controlled, my finances were managed without my input, my social connections were systematically severed, and my physical space was being reshaped around me without my consent. I was becoming a prisoner in my own home, watched over by jailers who insisted they were protecting me. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon when I decided to walk to the small grocery store 6 blocks away. It was something I'd done hundreds of times over the years, a simple errand that gave me fresh air, exercise, and a sense of independence. I needed milk and bread, basic items that shouldn't require permission or supervision. I bundled up against the cold, grabbed my purse and my reusable shopping bags, and headed for the front door. David appeared as if from nowhere, blocking my path with a concerned expression. "Where are you headed, Mom Helen?" "Just to Miller's Market for a few things," I said, trying to keep my voice light and normal. "We're out of milk." His frown deepened. "I don't think that's a good idea. The sidewalks are pretty icy today, and it's supposed to start snowing this afternoon. What if you slip and fall? What if you get caught in bad weather?" I looked out the window at the clear, cold day. There was no ice on the sidewalks, and the weather forecast had mentioned only a slight chance of flurries later in the evening. "I'll be careful," I said. "It's only 6 blocks. Why don't you make a list, and I'll pick up whatever you need when I'm out later," he suggested. "It's really not safe for you to be walking that far in this weather." "I need the exercise," I protested. "And I like choosing my own groceries." David's expression shifted, becoming patient but firm. "Mom Helen, I understand that you want to feel independent, but Rebecca and I can't take the risk of something happening to you while you're out alone. If you got hurt, we'd never forgive ourselves." There it was, the cage disguised as care. I couldn't leave my own house for a simple errand without their permission because they had decided it wasn't safe. My judgment about my own capabilities was irrelevant. Their assessment of my limitations was what mattered. "I'm going to the store," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "I'm a grown woman, and I can decide for myself whether it's safe to walk 6 blocks. David's face hardened almost imperceptibly. "I really can't let you do that, Mom Helen. Not in good conscience." "Can't let me." The words hung in the air between us like a sword. This man, living in my house, eating food I helped pay for, was telling me that he couldn't let me leave my own property for a perfectly reasonable errand. I stared at him for a long moment, seeing clearly for the first time what my life had become. I wasn't a beloved mother and grandmother being cared for by loving family members. I was a controlled asset being managed by people who had systematically stripped away my autonomy while convincing me it was for my own good. When Rebecca came home that evening and David told her about our confrontation, her reaction was swift and concerned. She sat beside me on the couch, her face full of the kind of worry usually reserved for people who were genuinely unwell. Mom, David told me about what happened today. I'm really concerned about you. This kind of defiance isn't like you at all. Are you feeling okay? Maybe we should make an appointment with Dr. Richardson to check if there's something medical going on. Defiance. As if asserting my basic rights as an adult was a symptom of illness rather than a natural response to being systematically controlled. As if wanting to maintain some shred of independence was a personality disorder that needed medical intervention. That night, lying in the guest room that had become my cell, I finally understood the full scope of what was happening to me. I wasn't being helped or protected or cared for. I was being systematically isolated, controlled, and diminished by people who claimed to love me but who were treating me like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. And the most terrifying part was how reasonable they made it all sound. How every restriction was framed as protection, every limitation presented as care, every reduction in my autonomy justified as being in my best interest. They weren't monsters. They were loving family members who had decided that my independence was a luxury they could no longer afford to allow me. I was disappearing into their vision of what an elderly mother should be, grateful, compliant, and gradually diminished, until I was nothing more than a warm body taking up space in what used to be my own life. And unless I found a way to fight back, unless I could somehow reclaim what was mine before it was too late, I would wake up one day to discover that Helen Morrison had ceased to exist entirely. The basement conversation happened on a Thursday night in March. I remember because Emma had just lost her first tooth that afternoon, and we'd all been celebrating with ice cream and stories about the tooth fairy. The house felt warm and full of laughter, the kind of evening that used to make me believe everything was perfect with our arrangement. After the children were tucked into bed, Rebecca and David asked me to join them in the living room for what they called a family meeting. The phrase sent ice through my veins, but I sat down in what used to be my favorite armchair, now positioned awkwardly against the wall where it didn't quite fit. David cleared his throat and pulled out a folder I'd seen him carrying around for several days. Mom, Helen, we need to discuss some practical matters about our living situation. Rebecca and I have been doing a lot of thinking about the future, about what's best for everyone involved. Rebecca leaned forward, her expression serious but kind. Mom, you know how much we love having you here, how grateful we are for everything you've done for us. But we're starting to worry about some things. What kind of things? I asked, though I was already bracing myself for another lecture about my declining capabilities. David opened the folder and pulled out several documents. Well, for starters, the house maintenance is becoming a real issue. The heating system is old, the roof needs work, and there are some foundation concerns that could become serious problems if they're not addressed soon. I stared at him, confused. What foundation concerns? I've never noticed any problems. That's exactly what we're worried about, Rebecca said gently. You might not be noticing things that would be obvious to younger eyes. David's been doing some research, and there are definitely some structural issues that need professional attention. David nodded and spread out what looked like official documents across the coffee table. I had a contractor friend come by and do an informal assessment while you were napping last week. The foundation has some settling that could lead to serious problems, and the electrical system is definitely not up to current code standards. Why didn't you tell me about this inspection? I asked, my voice sharper than I'd intended. Rebecca's hand found mine, her touch meant to be comforting, but somehow feeling more like restraint. We didn't want to worry you unnecessarily. We thought it would be better to get all the facts first and then present you with solutions rather than just problems. Solutions. I was learning to dread that word when it came from their mouths. What kind of solutions? David leaned back, in his chair, his expression taking on the patient tone he used when explaining complex concepts to his construction clients. The repairs we're talking about are extensive and expensive. We're looking at probably $60,000 to $80,000 in necessary work, and that's just to bring everything up to basic safety standards. The number hit me like a physical blow. $80,000. I had savings, but not nearly enough to cover that kind of expense. My retirement account was comfortable but not extravagant, designed to support a modest lifestyle, not major home renovations. "Are you sure these repairs are really necessary?" I asked weakly. Rebecca squeezed my hand. "Mom, we wouldn't bring this to you if it wasn't serious. David knows construction, and he's really concerned about some of the things he's seeing. We can't take the risk of something happening to you or the children because we ignored safety issues." Safety issues. The children. They knew exactly which buttons to push to make me feel responsible for potential disasters. If something happened to Emma or Joshua because I'd been too stubborn or too cheap to address structural problems, I'd never forgive myself. "But I don't have that kind of money readily available," I admitted, hating how small and helpless my voice sounded. David nodded sympathetically. "We figured that might be the case. That's actually why we wanted to talk to you tonight. Rebecca and I have been discussing some options that might work for everyone." Rebecca's grip on my hand tightened slightly. "What if we took over the major expenses for the house? David's business is doing really well now, and we could handle the repairs, the property taxes, the insurance, all of that. You wouldn't have to worry about any of the financial stress." "That's incredibly generous," I said slowly. "But this is my house. I can't let you pay for everything." David's smile was warm, but somehow condescending. "Mom, Helen, you've been supporting us for months. Let us return the favor. Besides, it makes financial sense. We're going to be living here long-term anyway, so we're really investing in our own future as much as yours." Their own future. In my house. The assumption that this arrangement was permanent was becoming more explicit, but somehow I'd never actually agreed to that permanence. When had temporary help become indefinite residence become their permanent home? "There is one thing we'd need to address, though," David continued, his tone becoming more businesslike. "For insurance purposes and to make sure we can get the permits for the major work, it would be easier if the house was in our name. Just from a legal and financial perspective." The room went very quiet. Even the old house seemed to stop its settling and creaking, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. "You want me to sign the house over to you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Rebecca's response was immediate and reassuring. "Not permanently, Mom. Just while we're handling all the major expenses and repairs. It's really common in situations like this. David's lawyer says it protects everyone involved and makes the financial arrangements much cleaner." David nodded enthusiastically. "It's basically just a formality. You'd still live here, still be part of every decision. But from a legal standpoint, it would make everything much simpler. And when we're older and the kids are grown, we could always transfer it back or work out some other arrangement." When we're older. As if I wasn't already older. Already at the stage of life where my judgment couldn't be trusted, my ownership couldn't be maintained, my autonomy couldn't be respected. They were talking about my future as if I were already incompetent, already in need of management by more capable people. "I need to think about this," I said, trying to pull my hand away from Rebecca's grip. Her hold tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course you do. This is a big decision. But Mom, I really hope you'll consider how much easier this would make everything for all of us. No more worrying about repairs or taxes or insurance. No more stress about maintaining such a big property. You could just relax and enjoy your retirement. Relax and enjoy your retirement. In other words, sit quietly in the corner and be grateful while they took ownership of everything I'd worked for my entire adult life." David gathered up his documents and closed the folder. "Why don't you sleep on it? We don't need an answer right away. But the spring weather is coming, and it would be good to get started on some of these repairs before winter comes around again." That night, I lay in the guest room staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Everything they'd said sounded logical, caring, practical. They were offering to relieve me of financial burdens I genuinely couldn't handle alone. They were providing security for my future and safety for my grandchildren. They were being generous and thoughtful and responsible. So why did I feel like I was being robbed? Over the next few days, the pressure became subtle but constant. Rebecca would mention how much easier it would be to coordinate repairs if David had legal authority to sign contracts. David would point out potential safety hazards I'd supposedly missed, always ending with comments about how much simpler everything would be once the paperwork was sorted out. The children, without understanding the implications, began echoing the adults' themes. Emma asked why Grandma Helen looked so worried all the time, and if it was because the house was broken. Joshua, barely old enough to form complete sentences, started calling various rooms Daddy's office and Mommy's kitchen, as if ownership had already transferred in his young mind. I tried to research the legal implications of what they were, proposing, but my access to information was limited. David had changed all the internet passwords for security reasons, and my computer was old and increasingly unreliable. When I asked to use David's laptop to look something up, he always had a reasonable excuse for why it wasn't available. My attempts to contact a lawyer independently were similarly frustrated. The phone book was mysteriously missing, and when I tried to call directory assistance, Rebecca happened to walk by and offered to help me with whatever I was trying to look up. When I mentioned wanting to speak with an attorney about estate planning, she looked concerned and suggested we find someone together so she could help me understand all the legal language. "Mom, these financial and legal matters can be so confusing," she said with genuine seeming worry. "I'd hate for you to get taken advantage of by some lawyer who doesn't have your best interests at heart. Let me and David help you find someone reputable. Someone reputable who would undoubtedly be chosen for their willingness to support Rebecca and David's narrative rather than their commitment to protecting my interests." I was being systematically cut off from independent advice, isolated from anyone who might tell me that signing over my house was anything other than a wonderful solution to everyone's problems. The manufactured crises began escalating. David discovered a dangerous electrical problem that needed immediate attention. Rebecca found evidence of possible water damage in the basement that could indicate serious structural issues. Every day brought a new emergency that supposedly required expensive professional intervention. "We really can't wait much longer." "On these repairs," David said during one of our increasingly frequent family meetings, "some of these problems could become dangerous if we don't address them soon. And with spring rain coming, any water issues could get exponentially worse." The contractor estimates he showed me were staggering. Not just the 60 to 80,000 he'd originally mentioned, but now over 100,000 for what he claimed were necessary immediate repairs. The numbers were so large they felt almost abstract, but the implied threat was concrete. Address these problems now, or risk disaster for your family. "I could take out a home equity loan," I offered weakly, though I wasn't even sure if my income would qualify me for such a large amount. Rebecca shook her head sadly. "Mom, at your age, with your income, no bank is going to give you a loan that large. And even if they did, the payments would be enormous. You'd be house poor, struggling to afford basic necessities just to pay the mortgage." At your age. There it was again, the gentle but persistent reminder that I was past the point where normal financial institutions would trust my judgment or my ability to manage significant debt. I was being categorized as too old, too risky, too incompetent to handle my own affairs. "Besides," David added, "if something happened to you, the kids would inherit a house with a massive mortgage. That's not fair to them. Our way, the house, gets fixed up properly, and everyone's financial future is secure." If something happened to me, the implication that my death was an immediate concern, a practical matter that needed to be planned for rather than a distant possibility, made my blood run cold. I was healthy, active, and statistically likely to live for decades more. But, in their narrative, I was already on the threshold of incapacity or death, already in need of arrangements that would protect others from the burden of my existence. The basement suggestion came up almost casually during one of these conversations. David mentioned that if we were going to be doing major renovations, it might be more comfortable for me to move to a quieter part of the house during the construction. "The guest room is going to be pretty noisy once we start the electrical work," he said thoughtfully. "All that drilling and rewiring. And with the foundation repairs, there's going to be a lot of heavy equipment and workers coming and going. It might be better if you had somewhere more private and peaceful to stay." Rebecca nodded enthusiastically. "The basement is actually quite cozy once you set it up right. It's cooler in the summer, quieter, and you'd have your own space without all the construction chaos." The basement, cold, damp, underground, with one small window that barely let in natural light. They were suggesting I move to the basement of my own house to accommodate renovations I hadn't agreed to, funded by a transfer of ownership I hadn't consented to. "It would just be temporary," Rebecca assured me. "Just during the worst of the construction. Maybe a few months at most." A few months of living in my own basement while they renovated my house with my money after I'd signed away my ownership. The plan was becoming clear, and it was breathtaking. In its audacity, they were going to isolate me physically, financially, and legally, then present it all as a generous gift they were giving me. "I don't think I'm ready to make any of these decisions," I said, my voice stronger than I'd expected. "This is all moving very fast, and I need time to consider my options." David's expression shifted slightly, becoming less patient and more businesslike. "Mom, Helen, I understand that change is hard, but some of these repairs really can't wait. The electrical situation in particular could be a serious safety hazard. We can't risk something happening to the children because we waited too long to address a known problem." The children. Always the children. The ultimate emotional leverage, the one argument I couldn't counter without seeming selfish and irresponsible. If I delayed repairs that could potentially harm Emma and Joshua, I would be the villain in this story. The stubborn old woman who put her own comfort above her grandchildren's safety. "Let me at least get a second opinion on the repairs," I said desperately. "Maybe the problems aren't as severe as your contractor friend thinks." Rebecca and David exchanged one of their meaningful looks, the kind that had become a common form of communication between them whenever I raised objections or questions. "Of course," Rebecca said smoothly, "though I'm not sure how we'd arrange that without disrupting our contractor's schedule. And honestly, Mom, David has enough experience in construction to know when something is serious. I trust his judgment. Completely. I trust his judgment completely. More than she trusted mine about my own house, my own financial capacity, my own future. In her mind, David's assessment of my property was more reliable than my own knowledge of the place I'd lived for 15 years. That night, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. I was going to find a way to get independent advice, even if it meant defying their careful management of my access to information. I was going to fight for my house, my autonomy, and my dignity before it was too late. But I was also going to be very, very careful about how I went about it. Because I was beginning to understand that the people who claimed to love me most were also the people most invested in making sure I never regained control of my own life. The next morning, I waited until Rebecca left for work and David departed for a supposed job site meeting. Then I bundled up in my warmest coat, grabbed my purse, and walked out my front door for the first time in months without asking permission or explaining my destination. It was time to find out just how much trouble I was really in and whether there was still time to save myself from the beautiful trap my own family had built around me. My walk to Margaret Patterson's house took 45 minutes, but it felt like a journey back to myself. Margaret had been my friend since Rebecca was in elementary school, one of the few people who knew me as Helen first and somebody's mother second. She lived in a tidy blue cottage 8 blocks away, close enough that I'd walked there hundreds of times over the years, far enough that Rebecca and David would never think to look for me there. Margaret answered the door with flour on her apron and surprise on her face. "Helen, what a wonderful surprise. I was just making bread. Come in, you look frozen." Her kitchen was warm and filled with the smell of rising dough and cinnamon. I sat at her familiar table, wrapped my hands around a mug of coffee, and for the first time in months felt like I could breathe properly. Margaret bustled around, giving me time to settle myself before she sat down across from me with her own mug. "Now then," she said gently, "what's going on? You look like someone who's been carrying the world on her shoulders." The story poured out of me in a rush. Everything from the initial invitation to stay, to the gradual takeover of my house, to the pressure to sign away my deed. Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression growing more troubled with each detail I shared. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and took my hand. "Helen, honey, what you're describing sounds like elder abuse, financial elder abuse, specifically." The words hit me like cold water. Elder abuse. I'd heard the term before, always applied to other people, vulnerable seniors who fell victim to scammers or neglectful caretakers. I'd never imagined it could apply to me, or that it could come wrapped in love and concern from my own daughter. "But they're not hurting me," I protested weakly. "They're trying to help." Margaret's expression was kind but firm. Taking control of someone's finances, isolating them from friends and support systems, pressuring them to sign over property. Those are all forms of abuse, even when they're done by family members who claim they're helping. She disappeared into her study and returned with a Yellow Pages phone book, something I hadn't seen in months. "We're going to call some people. First, we're calling my nephew Thomas. He's a lawyer who specializes in elder law. Then we're calling Adult Protective Services to find out what your options are." Thomas Patterson met us at his office that afternoon. He was a serious man in his 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. I told my story again, more coherently this time, while he took notes and asked pointed questions about the timeline of events. "Mrs. Morrison," he said when I finished, "I need to ask you directly. Do you want to sign your house over to your daughter and son-in-law?" "No," I said immediately. "I don't. But they're saying the repairs are necessary, that I can't afford them, that this is the only practical solution." He leaned back in his chair. "Let's address those claims one by one. First, have you seen these contractor estimates yourself? Did you speak directly with any of the contractors who supposedly identified these problems?" I realized with growing anger that I hadn't. Every estimate, every assessment, every urgent repair recommendation had been filtered through David. I'd never spoken to a single contractor or inspector directly. "I thought not," Thomas said grimly. "That's a red flag. Second, even if the repairs are necessary, signing over your deed is not the only way to pay for them. There are home improvement loans, reverse mortgages, and other options that don't require you to give up ownership of your property." He pulled out a legal pad and began writing. "Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to draw up a power of attorney document that gives me temporary authority to act on your behalf in financial matters. This will prevent anyone else from pressuring you into signing documents while we sort this out. Then we're going to get independent contractor assessments of your property to determine what repairs, if any, are actually necessary." "What if they're right about the problems?" I asked. "What if the house really does need expensive repairs?" "Then we'll explore legitimate financing options that don't require you to give up your home," he said simply. "Mrs. Morrison, you're a competent adult with the right to make your own decisions about your property. No one has the right to coerce you into signing anything, regardless of their relationship to you or their stated motivations." The Adult Protective Services caseworker, a woman named Janet Williams, arrived at Thomas's office an hour later. She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her 30s, but she spoke with the authority of someone who'd seen these situations before. "Mrs. Morrison, based on what you've told me, there are several concerning patterns here," she said, reviewing the notes Thomas had shared with her. "The isolation from friends and outside contacts, the control over your mail and finances, the pressure to sign over your property, these are all common tactics used in financial exploitation cases." She explained that she could open an investigation, but that it would be more effective if I took some proactive steps first. "The most important thing is to reassert your independence safely. We need to document what's been happening and make sure you have support systems they can't control." Margaret, who had been quietly listening to everything, spoke up. "Helen, you're going to come stay with me for a few days while we sort this out. You need some space to think clearly without constant pressure." The relief I felt at her offer was overwhelming. A safe place to sleep, time to think, people who respected my right to make my own decisions. It felt like being offered water after days in the desert. Thomas began drawing up documents while Janet explained the process of filing a complaint, if necessary. "We'll need to move carefully," she warned. "Financial exploitation cases involving family members can be complex, especially when the perpetrators can claim they were acting in the victim's best interest." By 5 o'clock that afternoon, I had a plan. Thomas would send a certified letter to Rebecca and David informing them that I was revoking any informal arrangements regarding my finances and that all future communications about my property should go through him. Janet would conduct a preliminary investigation into their handling of my mail and finances, and I would stay with Margaret until I felt strong enough to reclaim my own home. The hardest part was calling Rebecca to tell her where I was. Her reaction was swift and predictable. "Mom, what are you doing? Margaret called and said you were staying with her, but that doesn't make any sense. Why would you leave when we're in the middle of planning all these repairs? David's really worried about the electrical situation." I took a deep breath. "Rebecca, I need some time to think about everything we've discussed. I'm not comfortable with the arrangement you and David proposed, and I want to explore other options." Her voice took on the patient, slightly condescending tone I'd learned to dread. "Mom, I think you're confused about what we're trying to do here. We're not trying to take anything away from you. We're trying to help you manage responsibilities that are becoming too much for you to handle alone." "I'm not confused," I said, my voice stronger than I'd expected. "I understand exactly what you're proposing, and I'm not interested in signing over my house to anyone." There was a long pause, and when Rebecca spoke again, her tone had changed. Gone was the gentle patience, replaced by something sharper and more urgent. "Mom, this isn't just about you anymore. We've made commitments based on our discussions. David's already talked to contractors, arranged financing, made plans. You can't just change your mind and leave us hanging." Made commitments. Arranged. Financing. Plans that apparently depended on my cooperation, but had been made without my final consent. I was beginning to understand that in their minds, my agreement had never been in question. They'd been proceeding as though my signature was a formality rather than a choice. "Rebecca, I never actually agreed to sign the house over to you. We discussed it, but I never said yes." Her laugh was sharp and humorless. "Mom, come on, you've been living with this plan for weeks. You asked us to take over the household expenses, to handle the repairs, to manage the financial decisions. What did you think that meant?" What I'd thought it meant was that they were helping me while living in my house. What they'd apparently thought it meant was that I was gradually transferring ownership and authority to them in exchange for their assistance. We'd been having completely different conversations, and I was only now realizing how carefully they'd guided me toward their interpretation. "I need you to come home," Rebecca continued, her voice taking on a pleading quality. "Emma keeps asking where Grandma Helen is, and Joshua is confused. You're upsetting the children by leaving like this. The children. The ultimate weapon in her arsenal. The one argument that had always worked before. But this time, instead of feeling guilty, I felt angry. She was using Emma and Joshua's love for me as a tool to manipulate me back into compliance. The children will be fine, I said firmly. I'll see them soon. But I need some space right now to sort things out. Sort what out? Mom, there's nothing to sort out. We're family. We're trying to help you. Why are you making this so complicated? Because it wasn't help if it came with strings attached. Because generosity that required me to give up my independence wasn't generosity at all. Because I was finally understanding the difference between being cared for and being controlled. I'll call you in a few days, I said. Please don't come to Margaret's house. I need this time to think. I hung up before she could respond, my hands shaking from the adrenaline of finally standing up for myself. Margaret brought me a cup of tea and sat beside me on her couch. That sounded difficult, she said gently. I've never talked to her like that before, I admitted. I've never just refused to do what she thought was best for me. Margaret smiled sadly. Maybe it's time you started. That night, sleeping in Margaret's guest room with clean sheets and a warm quilt, I felt more rested than I had in months. There was no one monitoring my movements, no one questioning my decisions, no one explaining why my choices weren't appropriate for someone my age. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I was free to think clearly about what I wanted rather than what everyone else thought I needed. The next morning, Thomas called with an update. I've reviewed your financial records, and there are some concerning discrepancies. Several of your bills have been paid from accounts you didn't authorize, and there are charges on your credit cards that you didn't make. Nothing criminal necessarily, but definitely unauthorized use of your financial resources. My stomach dropped. What kind of charges? Home improvement supplies, contractor deposits, even some personal purchases that appear to be for Rebecca. And David. The pattern suggests they've been using your accounts pretty freely, probably justifying it as shared household expenses. Thousands of dollars. Money I'd worked decades to save, spent without my knowledge or consent on improvements. To my own house that would primarily benefit the people who were trying to take it away from me. The audacity was breathtaking. What can we do about it? I asked. First, we're changing all your passwords and account numbers. I've already started that process. Second, we're going to demand an accounting of every penny they've spent and documentation for every repair they claim is necessary. Third, if they don't cooperate, we're filing criminal charges for financial exploitation. Criminal charges against my own daughter. The thought made me feel sick, but it also made me angry. I'd raised Rebecca to be honest and responsible, to respect other people's property and autonomy. How had she become someone who would steal from her own mother while claiming it was love? David showed up at Margaret's house that afternoon. I watched from the window as he knocked persistently on the front door, his expression cycling through concerned, frustrated, and finally angry when no one answered. Margaret had wisely suggested we not open the door, and after 20 minutes of knocking and calling my name, he finally left. Rebecca tried a different approach, calling Margaret directly. I could hear Margaret's side of the conversation from the kitchen where I was attempting to read a book and failing to concentrate. No, Rebecca, I don't think that's a good idea. She's not refusing to see you. She just needs some space. I understand you're worried, but pressuring her isn't going to help. Yes, I'll give her the message, but I'm not going to force her to call you back. When Margaret hung up, she came to find me. She wants you to know that Emma is asking for you and that they're willing to compromise on the house situation. Compromise. As if my desire to keep ownership of my own home was an extreme position that required negotiation. As if my refusal to sign away my life's work was selfish stubbornness that needed to be managed with concessions. What kind of compromise? I asked, though I was fairly sure I didn't want to know. She didn't specify, but she mentioned something about you keeping partial ownership while they handled all the responsibilities. She made it sound very generous. Partial ownership of my own house. How magnanimous of them to offer me a minority, stake in my own property in exchange for their management of my life. The more I learned about their true attitudes, the more grateful I became that I'd escaped before signing anything. The independent contractor assessments began that Friday. Thomas had arranged for 3 different professionals to evaluate my house and provide honest assessments of its condition. I met them at the property while Rebecca was at work, and David was supposedly at a job site. The first contractor, a man named Bob Martinez with 30 years of experience, walked through my house with a thorough but efficient inspection. After 2 hours, he sat with me at my kitchen table and delivered his verdict. "Mrs. Morrison, your house is in excellent condition for its age. There are a few minor maintenance items, a window that could use recaulking, a gutter that's pulling slightly away from the roofline, but nothing that constitutes an emergency or a safety hazard." I felt like crying with relief. What about the foundation? I was told there were serious settling issues. He looked puzzled. I didn't see any foundation problems. The basement is dry, the floors are level, and there are no cracks or signs of structural movement. Whoever told you there were foundation issues was either mistaken or lying. Lying. The word hung in the air between us like an accusation. David hadn't been mistaken about structural problems. He'd invented them. The urgent repairs, the safety hazards, the immediate need for expensive intervention, all of it had been fabricated to pressure me into signing over my property. What about the electrical system? I asked, though I was already beginning to understand the answer. Up to code and functioning properly. It's not the newest system, but it's safe and adequate for your needs. I didn't see anything that would require immediate attention. The second and third contractors confirmed Bob's assessment. My house was solid, safe, and well-maintained. The repairs David had insisted were urgently necessary simply didn't exist. The $100,000 in contractor estimates he'd shown me were for work that wasn't needed on problems that weren't real. I sat in my own kitchen after the contractors left, staring at the familiar room where I'd been manipulated and lied to for months. The people I'd trusted most had invented an elaborate fiction about my home's condition to justify taking it away from me. They'd used my love for my grandchildren and my fear of being a burden to coerce me into giving up everything I'd worked for. The rage that filled me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Not the quick flash of anger that comes and goes, but a deep, burning fury at the betrayal, at the calculation, at the sheer audacity of people who would steal from their own family while claiming it was love. Thomas called that evening with more disturbing news. "I've been investigating David's construction business, and there are some red flags. He's facing several lawsuits from clients who claim he took payment for work he never completed. His business license has been suspended twice for failure to pay taxes, and there are liens against his personal property for unpaid debts." The picture was becoming clearer. David wasn't a successful contractor recovering from temporary financial difficulties. He was a failing businessman with serious debt problems who saw my house as a solution to his financial crisis. My home wasn't just shelter for his family. It was an asset he could claim, improve with my money, and potentially sell or borrow against to solve his business problems. "What about Rebecca?" I asked. Did she know about his financial situation? Thomas was quiet for a moment. It's hard to say for certain, but given how closely they've been working together on this scheme, it's unlikely she was completely unaware. At minimum, she knew they were pressuring you to sign over your property and chose to participate in that pressure. That night, I made another decision. I wasn't just going to protect myself from their manipulation. I was going to make sure they faced consequences for what they'd done. The theft, the lies, the emotional abuse, All of it needed to be documented and reported. Janet Williams came to Margaret's house the next morning to take my formal statement. I told her everything, providing documentation of the unauthorized financial transactions, the fabricated repair estimates, and the systematic isolation I'd experienced. She listened with professional sympathy and growing concern. "Mrs. Morrison, this is one of the more clear-cut cases of financial elder abuse I've seen," she said when I finished. "The pattern of behavior is textbook. Gain the victim's trust, isolate them from support systems, create artificial crises that require immediate action, then present surrender of assets as the only reasonable solution." She explained that she would be opening a formal investigation and that criminal charges were likely. "I need to warn you that this is going to be difficult. Your daughter and son-in-law are going to claim they were acting in your best interest, and family members often rally around the accused in these situations." I thought about Emma and Joshua, about the relationships that would be damaged, about the family gatherings that would never be the same. The cost of fighting back was going to be enormous, but the cost of not fighting back, losing my home, my independence, and my dignity, was even higher. "I understand," I said. "I'm ready to do whatever it takes." The confrontation came on Monday morning. Rebecca and David arrived at Margaret's house unannounced, apparently deciding that ignoring my request for space was their best strategy. I watched from the window as they marched up the front walkway with the determined expressions of people who'd come to collect what they considered rightfully theirs. This time, I answered the door myself. Margaret stood behind me for support, but I was the one who faced them. "Mom, this has gone on long enough," Rebecca said without preamble. "You need to come home and stop this nonsense. The children are upset, David's contractors are waiting, and you're creating problems for everyone." Creating problems. As if protecting my own property was somehow an inconvenience to their plans, rather than my fundamental right as an adult. "Rebecca," I said calmly, "I'm not coming home until some things are resolved. I've discovered that the repair estimates David showed me were fabricated. I've had independent contractors assess my house, and there are no urgent problems that need addressing." David's face flushed red. "That's ridiculous. I know construction, and I know when a house has problems. Your contractors don't know what they're talking about." 3 separate contractors, I said, all with decades of experience, all saying the same thing, that my house is in excellent condition and doesn't need major repairs. Rebecca's expression shifted, becoming defensive. "Even if the problems aren't as severe as we thought, that doesn't change the fact that you're struggling to manage the house on your own. You need help, Mom, whether you want to admit it or not." "I need help," I agreed, "but not the kind of help that requires me to sign over my property. Not the kind of help that involves using my credit cards without permission or opening my mail or preventing me from leaving my own house." David stepped forward, his patience clearly exhausted. "Look, Helen, we've bent over backwards to help you. We've supported you, taken care of your house, dealt with your bills. The least you could do is show some gratitude instead of making wild accusations." Wild accusations, as if documented theft was somehow a misunderstanding rather than a crime. "David," I said, my voice steel steady, "I have bank records showing thousands of dollars in unauthorized charges on my accounts. I have contractor reports proving that your repair estimates were false, and I have documentation showing that you've been intercepting my mail and controlling my access to information. These aren't accusations, they're facts." For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I saw genuine fear in their faces. They'd been so confident in their control over me, so certain that I would never challenge their authority or question their motives, that they'd become careless about covering their tracks. Rebecca tried one more emotional appeal. "Mom, please. We're family. Families work through problems together. Don't let lawyers and social workers turn you against your own daughter. Turn me against my own daughter. As if I hadn't been turned against myself first, manipulated into questioning my own judgment and surrendering my own rights. As if protecting myself from their exploitation was somehow a betrayal of family bonds. "Rebecca," I said sadly, "you turned me against myself first. You made me doubt my own capabilities, my own judgment, my own worth. You used my love for you and the children to manipulate me into giving up everything I've worked for. That's not what families do to each other." I pulled out the papers Thomas had prepared and handed them to David. "This is a cease and desist order. You're to have no further contact with my financial institutions, no access to my mail, and no authority to make decisions about my property. Any further unauthorized use of my accounts will result in criminal charges." David's face went from red to pale as he scanned the legal document. Rebecca read over his shoulder, her expression cycling through disbelief, anger, and finally something that might have been fear. "You're making a huge mistake," David said, his voice tight with suppressed fury. "We were trying to help you, and this is how you repay us? By threatening us with lawyers and criminal charges?" "I'm repaying your help by protecting myself from further exploitation," I replied. "If your help was genuine, you won't mind documenting every penny you've spent and every decision you've made on my behalf." Rebecca's composure finally cracked. "Fine," she snapped. "If this is how you want to handle things, don't expect us to keep taking care of you. Don't expect us to be there when you really do need help, and don't expect the children to understand why Grandma Helen chose strangers over family." The threat was clear. Comply with our demands or lose access to your grandchildren. It was the ultimate manipulation, the one weapon they knew would hurt me most. For a moment, I wavered, imagining holidays without Emma's laughter, birthdays without Joshua's hugs, a future empty of the relationships that mattered most to me. But then I thought about the alternative. A future where I lived in my own basement, where my every decision was monitored and controlled, where my love for my grandchildren was used as a leash to keep me compliant. A future where I disappeared bit by bit until there was nothing left of Helen Morrison except a grateful old woman who caused no trouble and asked for nothing. "Rebecca," I said quietly, "if you use those children as weapons against me, you'll be showing them that love is conditional and that family loyalty means accepting abuse. Is that really what you want to teach them?" She stared at me for a long moment, perhaps seeing me clearly for the first time in months, not as the declining elderly mother who needed management, but as the woman who'd raised her to be strong and independent, who'd sacrificed everything to give her opportunities, who'd loved her unconditionally even when she didn't deserve it. For just a second, I saw a flicker of the daughter I'd raised, the one who would have been horrified by what she'd become. But then David touched her arm, and the moment passed. "Come on," he said to Rebecca. "We don't need to stand here and listen to this." He turned back to me with undisguised hostility. "You'll regret this decision, Helen. When you're sitting alone in that house with no one to help you, remember that you chose this." They left without another word, walking away from Margaret's house and out of my life, with the same determination they'd once used to take it over. I watched them go, feeling simultaneously heartbroken and liberated. Margaret put her arm around my shoulders. "How do you feel?" I considered the question seriously. I felt sad about the relationships that had been damaged, angry about the betrayal I'd endured, and scared about the uncertain future ahead of me. But underneath all of that, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. I felt free. "I feel like myself again," I said finally. The legal proceedings took 6 months to resolve. David was charged with financial exploitation of an elderly person, theft, and fraud. Rebecca was charged as an accessory. Both eventually pled guilty to reduced charges in exchange for full restitution of the money they'd stolen and a formal agreement to have no contact with me for 2 years. I moved back into my house, reclaiming my bedroom, my routines, and my independence. The repairs I chose to make were minor and affordable: new paint in the guest room, updated fixtures in the bathroom, a better heating system for the basement. My house was exactly what the contractors had said: solid, safe, and well-maintained. The hardest part was losing regular contact with Emma and Joshua. Rebecca honored the no-contact agreement, which meant I couldn't see my grandchildren even if I wanted to. But Margaret helped me understand that this loss, painful as it was temporary. Children grow up, form their own opinions, make their own choices about relationships. Someday, when they were older, I could tell them my side of the story and let them decide for themselves. In the meantime, I rebuilt my life on my own terms. I rejoined my book club, returned to my volunteer work at the literacy center, and reconnected with friends I'd been isolated from. I took a watercolor painting class, traveled to visit my sister in Arizona, and learned to use a computer well enough to video chat with old friends. Most importantly, I learned to trust my own judgment again. The woman who'd been manipulated into questioning her, every decision was replaced by someone who knew her own mind and wasn't afraid to speak it. I was still Helen Morrison, retired teacher and grandmother, but I was also someone new, a survivor who'd fought for her independence and won. The deed to my house remained in my name, where it belonged. And when I eventually needed help managing my affairs, it would be help that I chose, from people I trusted, on terms that respected my dignity and autonomy. I would never again mistake control for care or manipulation for love. I'd learned the hard way that sometimes the people who claim to love you most are the ones most willing to steal your life away, one small concession at a time. But I'd also learned that it's never too late to fight back, never too late to reclaim what's yours, and never too late to remember who you really are beneath all the voices telling you who you should be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.